Hey folks, Matt Easton here, scholagladiatoria. So the question comes up quite often, why would some crazy bugger want to use something like a rapier on horseback, or indeed a small sword? Okay, and admittedly, neither of these swords really are designed with horsemanship or horseback fighting, mounted combat, without those really being the primary goal of those weapons. They are weapons probably, maybe arguably slightly less so in the case of the earlier rapier, and I'll talk about the difference between these two in a second. But they are not primarily intended as horsemen's weapons. And so the question comes up, why would someone on horseback use one of those swords? And the answer, I'm famous for being very verbose and stretching things out. I'm going to give you the answer straight away. It's because what you've got. Okay, if that's the sword you've got, that's what you use on horseback. I mean, to take this to the extreme, the Australians at Bathsheba famously used these 1907 pattern bayonets on horseback because they didn't have any swords issued to them at that time. So they used these. I'm not sure whether they used these in hand. I think they probably did, or whether they used them on rifles as some kind of lance, I don't know. But they made do if you have to do a cavalry action, if you have to fight on horseback, and what you happen to have is whatever, a bayonet or a small sword, then that's what you use. And quite simply, a gentleman, or many types of people in the 16th, well, more the 17th and 18th centuries would have had a rapier or a small sword. And if that is the sword that they have, and yes, normally they are, maybe they might be an expert duelist on foot, but they happen to be on horseback and the opponent happens to be on horseback, yes, they could dismount. They could dismount and fight on foot. Arguably, that might put them at a disadvantage. Some people actually, I think Marozzo talks about this all the way back in 1536, but and you could say Fiore does in 1410. But even if we go to 19th century sources, lots of people would argue that actually the person who's competent on foot, using a sword or a bayonet or whatever, on foot actually has an advantage over the horseman. Horsemen as a whole, generally speaking, have an advantage in a group, as a unit or a squadron, but fighting one-on-one on foot, if you're a musketeer, for example, and you have a rapier, then yes, indeed, your best option might be to get off the horse and fight the opponent. But sometimes you want to stay on your horse, and one very important reason for staying on your horse is because you can run away way better than you can if you get off your horse. And if you get off your horse mid-fight, so assuming that you didn't know this fight was going to happen, you see someone over there, maybe it's your worst enemy, or you've been sleeping with his wife, and he goes, "You bastard!" and pulls his sword out and starts charging at you. In that moment, you've got a choice. You either pull your sword out and fight on horseback, or you quickly dismount. If you quickly dismount, your horse probably isn't just going to stay standing there, it's going to move off some distance. So your ability, if things go bad, to get back on that horse and run away are minimal. So you might want to stay on the horse, and I think a lot of people instinctively, if they're suddenly attacked or suddenly find themselves in an encounter, especially if they're outnumbered, so if there are 2 or 3 opponents, then you're probably going to want to stay on the horse, because at least then you always have the option to try and flee, which if you get off your horse, you don't. So there are many situations why you might want to stay on the horse, and if you stay on the horse and you happen to have a rapier, if you're like D'Artagnan or whoever, and if you're someone who is usually equipped with a rapier and you usually fight on foot, then indeed you'll just use whatever is in your hand. And of course this goes especially for for gentlemen in the 18th century, who for the most part would have been carrying a small sword, wearing a small sword. And if that's the sword you've got, that's the sword you'll use. Now, actually, how bad are these swords? Well, most people, when we talk about cavalry swords, think about curved sabres and things like this palash. Yes, this is a 1796 heavy cavalry sword, and yes, I will be talking about this in an upcoming video. But usually people think about these sorts of swords as cavalry swords, and yes, admittedly, through most of history, during the period when small swords and rapiers existed, through that period it was usual for cavalry to retain swords that had they were usually larger and heavier, and they usually, not all of them, but most of them retained some degree of cutting potential. Yes, there were estocks. Yes, there were the cuirassier swords, which you can hit someone with, but they're not going to cut very well, but they are big, heavy swords. So cavalry swords, for a cavalry regiment, for a squadron of cavalrymen, they have different needs and different sort of primary goals, and the main things that they want from a sword are different, and so you do end up with different sword designs. And generally speaking, it's been rare in history, it's not been unheard of, but it's been rare in history for cavalry as a group. There might be individuals who are outliers, but it's been rare for cavalry as a group to be armed with weapons like rapiers or indeed small swords. And quite rightly, some of you will be thinking, based on what I've just said, oh, but towards the end of the 19th century and in the early 20th century, didn't lots of militaries actually give their cavalry's thrusting swords? Yes, that's true. And so I've got here a rare City of London yeomanry thrust-centric sword. It has a tiny bit of cutting capacity to it, but honestly, if I was using this in earnest, I wouldn't probably bother cutting or trying to cut anyone with it. I'd just use the point, because that's what it's most effectively designed for. And things like the Swedish 1893, the British 1908, the pattern, the US pattern sabre, which is really more like a rapier. These indeed do have blades, as I've shown examples of those. Well, here's one. I've shown examples of them. They do have blades which in many ways are more similar to rapiers. They have a reduced chopping capacity. They can obviously cut because they've got a sharp edge. Well, not all of them really have great cutting edges, but they have some degree to give a blow or a cut of dubious quality, but primarily they're thrusting swords. So indeed, yes, it's true, towards the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, there were specialised thrusting swords for cavalry. And the other example is the Polish koncers, or the estoc. These swords, which were probably primarily put in there as anti-armour, and like giant rondel daggers, basically anti-armour piercers, a bit like kind of wearable lances, short lances. But in the time of the estoc and the koncers, indeed, those soldiers, like the Polish hussars, did also carry a sabre for close-in melee fighting as well. So it is fair to say that there have been thrusting swords kind of like these used in history, and indeed, in the age of the rapier, there were cavalry forces that did have, shall we call them, military rapiers. And obviously the term rapier, as I've said many times in previous videos, is very kind of nebulous and kind of wide, and it's quite difficult to pin down what is a rapier. But I think most people would agree that a rapier is a primarily thrust-centric sword, even though a lot of rapiers, not all rapiers, a lot of rapiers have some cutting capacity as well. And in many situations, soldiers in the 17th century particularly did wear rapiers and did use rapiers as cavalry swords. So this kind of goes full circle. So number one, you might have a specialised foot combat thrusting sword, might be for duelling, might just be for general combat, but you might have a sword that is primarily designed to be used on foot, but you can still use it on horseback, because if that's the sword you've got, you'll use it. And additionally to that, there were some cavalry swords that were specialised thrusting swords that were used specifically for cavalry. And in addition to that, there were soldiers that carried these thrusting swords that did use them both on foot and on horseback, and maybe they weren't the most effective in the world, but they did, in the 17th century, for example, they did use these swords on horseback as well as using them on foot. So, to conclude, it is really not a simple matter. Whilst we can generalise and say that yes, cavalry swords often look different to foot combat swords, that's not always the case, and very often swords that are perhaps we'd normally think of them as swords for using on foot, they can be used on horseback, of course, because any sharp pointy object can be used on horseback, just like the bayonet I showed, just like a sharp stick, just like a lance, just anything can be used on horseback if you need to. So they might not be the best cavalry swords, but they were obviously good enough to do the job. And we shouldn't always necessarily categorically think of, I don't think anyone in the world would suggest that any large body of cavalry has ever been armed with small swords. But that being said, at the end of the day, what is the small sword? As I said, it is a pointy object that you hold in your hand. If that's what you've got and that's what you're going to use on horseback, well, you can still stab people with it. It's not very robust. It doesn't have very good hand protection. It's not very long. It's not an ideal cavalry sword, but you can use it. So I'm going to conclude there. So hopefully that sort of answers, in a nutshell, relatively concise by Matt Easton standards. Why did people ever use rapiers or small swords on horseback? Well, all of the reasons I've just described. Sometimes they chose to, sometimes it's just what they had. And at the end of the day, a pointy object is a pointy object. So we sometimes get fixated, especially on this channel, and especially anyone who's obsessed with swords as I am, which I know lots of you are, and just weapons in general, not just swords. We sometimes get fixated on the details and the differences and the designs and all of this kind of, we kind of get really excited over all of that. But at the end of the day, it's about a sharp object, whether it's edged or pointy, for taking out an opponent. And actually, in this situation, the important thing is whether you're sitting on the horse or whether you decide to get off it, and whether you're in a group or whether you're by yourself, and whether the enemy is in a group or by themselves, and these kind of things. Those are the big picture things, and we shouldn't lose sight of the big picture and the fact that at the end of the day, this is a pointy object and you're holding it. Thank you for watching. If you want to see more videos like this, subscribe. Please give this video a like, share it around, and I'll see you really soon back on the channel for another video on Scholagladiatoria channel with me, Matt Easton. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.